as usual, while I'm recording, you can, ask any questions that you might have that may come up. You can use the voice chat or the text chat. I'm only recording my bottom screen and my audio, so you won't be part of the recording. And so today we're talking about random. Uh, this is something that's going to be really useful in a lot of different contexts in programming, especially if you're trying to do something that's creative. But it's useful in a lot of in pretty much any application that you might have. So um, we are going to apply this to the pattern that we started working on Monday. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my P5 editor, and I'm going to log in, and I'll open up my my pattern template. And so this is something I made on Monday, just as a starting point for creating something with a pattern. And so I'll start here adding randomness. So I'll call this pattern with random. And so randomness doesn't have to be used with patterns. It's not the only time that you'll use it. But since a pattern is repeating the same sort of like group of shapes over and over again, it'll make it much more clear what's happening with the randomness. So that'll make it hopefully easier to understand how it works. I'm going to open up another window just to demonstrate some basic stuff before we get into our pattern as well. And I'll probably open up the console too, just in case. We may want to look at some stuff in there. So let's talk about randomness. So as I mentioned, random is very useful in when I make games. I make a lot of interactive animations and games and things like that. And I use like a crazy amount of randomness when I'm doing that because you can randomize a lot of things that it would be, hard to create on your own. So that's big in indie games, but it's big in, any type of game development, really. You can imagine like if you have a video game where you want to have some variability, so you don't want to have the same experience every time. So you want to have maybe different numbers of enemies or different levels of power-ups or different maps, things like that. Randomness is really, really useful for making a program that instead of like has your whole thing planned out, there's some variability, there's some unpredictability that goes into it. So um, in programming, we use some pretty heavy math to create randomness. And we don't really have to we don't have to go into how it works. Um, but it is a little bit, we're using some pretty insane math that we just kind of get by default. Um, and it's built into this JavaScript object that's just called math. In P5, they kind of like give us access to different parts of that object. So if I type in math here in the console, you can see there's a lot of stuff in here. And some of the stuff is like this pi. So remember in P5, we can just write pi. And that's not because P5, invented pi or even wrote down their version of pi. Basically, somewhere in P5, there's something that looks like this. It says something like let pi equal math dot pi. And so now you have pi. And so most of the math stuff that we get from P5 actually comes from the base of JavaScript, but P5 just kind of gives us easier access to it, so we don't have to write math in front of everything. So there's stuff in here like sine and cosine. We can do a lot of cool graphs and stuff like that with those. We can use them for animation. But then here you see that random function. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And that's super, super useful because we can just create random numbers, which is extremely hard to do in the real world. If you play board games, you probably have used like, a 20-sided die or 6-sided die, 8-sided die, whatever. And that's another way of creating randomness in a game. So you might have decisions or powers or whatever, and then you roll the dice to see what the outcome is. And so that's a physical form of randomness. That's using the physical properties of the dice to create a random outcome. Because when you roll the dice or if you flip a coin, you don't know in advance what side it will land on. So that's randomness, it's unpredictability. In on the computer, we use math to create randomness, and it's a lot more complicated the way it's done, and it's actually not as good as physical randomness, but we don't really need to worry too much about that. So if I say math.random, what you'll see is you just get a random number. So every time I put this into the console, I get these random numbers, and they're all between 0 and 1. So it's not super useful on its own, but if we take that number and then we do some different math with it, we can generate new colors, we can generate shapes and positions and sizes and all these different things that are unpredictable. So when we're in P5, they abstract the random function and they actually give us some extra functionality to it. So in P5, if you try to use random outside of the P5 function, so if I say like variable x equals random, let's just say 1 here, I'm going to get an error when I try to run this sketch. Random is not defined. So this random function only exists when we're inside of our setup in our draw function. So if I wanted to randomize x, let's say I was drawing an ellipse at x. So if I want to randomize x, I can't just do this. I have to, I can initialize x up here, and then I can set x. For now, I'll set it in setup. So I'll say x equals random. And if I just say random by itself, it's going to be the same. It's going to appear to be the same each time because as we just saw, x is going to be somewhere between 0 and 1. So if I run this a bunch of times, each time you're going to see that x is somewhere between 0 and 1. So it's some fraction between 0 and 1. And it's still random, but what we need to do is do some math with it. So what we could do is say something like random times 100, or we could use 400, we could use the whole canvas. And so now every time I run this sketch again, if I just refresh it, the circle starts in a different place because I'm getting a random number and it's between 0 and 1, but then I'm doing something similar to the map function that we saw before. I'm just like multiplying this tiny range by a much larger range. And so wherever it is in this tiny range is getting mapped to this much bigger range. And so that's how I can make my circle move in different places. And so P5 knows that that's something that we're going to want to do. So instead of having to do this math on our own, what we can do is just set the range for randomness. So if I just use one number like that, I'm going to get a random number between 0 and 400. So that's going to be the maximum value. Or actually, it's not really because I could make it negative. So I could say negative 400. Now we don't see it because it's negative, but so it's not really a max necessarily, but it's going to, whatever this number is, it's going to be a range between that and 0. So this is 0 to 400. And whatever number we get is going to be somewhere in that range. So again, if we look at the console, when I run this, each time it's random. It's not the same number, but it's never smaller than 0. It's never lower than 0, and it's never bigger than 400. So we can also set the minimum value for random. And so I could say I want the circle to be somewhere between 200 and 400. So now I've set the minimum and the maximum. And so now you can see the circle is always on the right side of the canvas every time I refresh it. So I can kind of control the randomness, so I still have some unpredictability, but I can control the area or the range of values that I'm randomly generating. And of course, I can go negative as well. So if I put a negative value here, if I say negative 400 to 400, there's going to be some cases where we just don't see the circle at all. So it's negative 190, so it's on the other side. It's off the canvas right now. So we can use those numbers to create different ranges of values that might be useful for depending on what we're doing. If we're making a color, if we're designing a shape or something like that, we want to be able to put in different ranges because our colors only go from 0 to 255, whereas our shapes may have different numbers and different positions. Okay, so let's continue. So we can randomize different aspects of our sketches. And I'll do a couple examples here, but then we'll probably move quickly into our pattern. So let's see. So in this one, we have random colors. And yeah, you can see I'm applying it to the pattern here. In this one, we have random sizes. So it changes every time I open it. And here we have random Y values. And here we have uh, random colors along with some other stuff as well. One thing that is a little tricky with randomness as we get with our loop is that you're going to be generating new values. And so for just today's lesson, in future lessons, we may bring it back. But just for today's lesson, we're probably going to get rid of that the draw function. And I'll show you why. If I take this x and I move it down to draw, and I say x equals random 400, and now I run this sketch again, now, every time we run through draw, we're creating a new random x value. And so our circle is constantly moving back and forth. We don't really want that. So, there's a couple ways that we can deal with this. One of the ways that we're going to do it is a little bit more sophisticated, which I'm going to show you guys next week. But to simplify things for tonight and just focus on one thing, what we're going to do is we're just going to get rid of the draw function altogether. And so if I just get rid of this draw function and I can cut that bracket there, so now I just have a setup function. The setup function can still draw. So even though it only runs once, if we ask it to draw stuff, it will. And so now we can use that randomness without having all the flickering, crazy stuff going on because we're not redrawing every time we use a randomness. So if you want to use randomness over and over again, you do have to use variables. And for what we're doing with the loop, we don't really want to have to make so many variables that we're going to save them all. It's a little bit cumbersome, at least for what we know how to do at this point. We may learn some other techniques for saving those values, and definitely, it's a little bit more advanced. We may not get to it this semester, but in the next semester of this class, you would learn data structures, and data structures are how you can save lots of different data, whether it's for an animation or a game or a social network. Saving data is a much more sort of complex topic than what we're going to get into tonight. But so we'll just stick with the setup function. So actually, let's go back to our pattern over here. And all I have to do to get rid of the draw function, since the setup function is usually right there, is just delete that bracket. And there we go. We have our setup. And we don't have a draw, but we can still draw inside of this pattern. So let's do some different variations. I'll just do a few different examples, and then we will look at how to post the assignment. So as I said, there's different ways that we can add randomness. So let's list them out, and we can make sure to hit all of them. So we can randomize color, we can randomize size, we can randomize position, and we can also make random choices, but we may leave that for later. Let's just stick with values. So let's just stick with color, size, position. Is there anything else I did in these examples? Why? Yeah, just color, size, and position. Okay. Um, and I didn't bring over my little self-portrait guy, so let's go find that, and I'll just copy the code. Um, I don't really need this. Let's open pattern loop. So I'm just going to grab my self-portrait guy and throw that in here. So I have my little faces. Let's put them in the middle. So I'm going to move this Y value up a little bit. Okay, so we've got our faces. So if we want to randomize some stuff, we can do that. I'm going to start with the color. So I'm going to turn off the stroke here. And if I want to randomize color, of course, I can't use just plum. What I need to do is I need to use numbers because I can't really randomize strings. I can, but we're not going to get into that tonight. But I can randomize numbers very easily. So instead of filling plum, let's just start with some numbers and then we'll go from there. So if I fill 0, we're going to get black. Of course, that's not very random, but we could put a random number in there. And so one thing that you can do, I'm going to create variables to make it a little bit easier to read, but if you want to try this, you can just throw random pretty much anywhere. So if I put a random number here and then put 255, I'm going to get some different grayscale values. So if I have one number for my fill, it's going to be somewhere between 0 and 255. But if I'm only specifying one number, I'm not using RGB. Remember, I use the grayscale. So I can already get some cool variation just by going somewhere between white and black. So I can just throw a random value directly into another parameter. But normally what I'll do is I'll say something like this variable, let's say C for color, and I'll say random, and I'll say 255. And then I'll put the C in there. So this way it makes it a little bit easier to read. We understand a little bit more what's happening. So another thing to notice here is that this fill changes every time we go through the loop because each time we go back through the loop, remember with our loop, each one of our, we draw everything inside of the loop and then we check our condition and then we go back to the beginning. So each time we go through, we're going to change the color here. If I did this before my loop, so if I grab this code and I'm just going to cut and move up here and paste right there. If I run that again, I come into this issue because, well, actually, I can just move this fill here. I could actually just do that. So now I'm still getting a random color, but now it's applying to every instance of my little pattern because I'm doing it before the loop. So I'm setting the variable and then I'm running through the loop. So the variable doesn't change. I'm just using the variable here. And so the application is the same each time. So depending on what kind of randomness you want, you could have a random background and a random, let's say I had another color here. So let's say variable, um, let's just use F for face, and I'll just do another random value here, just for the heck of it, and I'll put F in here. So now I have two random colors, but they're the same for each copy of my pattern. So that's kind of cool. I can create some randomness within the pattern or with the sketch itself, but the pattern stays the same. Whereas if I just move this little F guy down here, now I'm going to get a different color for each face. So if you wanted the same background of the face, but different color of the foreground, you can do that. And if I want every one of them to be a little bit different, I can move this back into my loop and now they're all a little bit different. Okay, so that's kind of fun, but we can do more, right? We can add red, green, and blue. So let's change this to red. Let's say R for red and put an R in here. And then of course, we can just copy and paste, set this to green, G for green and B for blue. And I'm using abbreviations here partly because it's obviously takes less time to write, but I'm also doing it because red, green, and blue are actually functions in P5 that tell you how much of red or green or blue is in another color. And so I don't want to do that. So I just put in R, comma, G, comma, B for my red, green, blue. And now I'm going to have random colors that go all across our color spectrum. So sometimes they still might be gray if the colors are close enough together, if the numbers that I choose are close enough together. But now we get all these different random colors. That's kind of nice. You can get completely random colors. But the thing that's cool about using these random functions is you may want to kind of constrain where those colors can be. You may say, I actually really don't like blue all that much. So if I change this number down here to like 100, now there's a little bit of blue because you do need some blue to get the lighter colors. If you have zero blue, you're never going to get to the more lighter end of the spectrum. So we do want a little bit of blue, but if our red and our green are higher than our blue, we're much less likely to get blue. So it's still random, but it's controlled a little bit. We have some influence over what the possible outcomes are. And then you could say, you know what, I don't like red that much either, so let's just make sure there's a fair amount of green. And then even though I have only up to 100 red and only up to 100 blue, I'm still getting colors that are not green. They're not very often. It's more likely that I'm getting a green color. You can see there's 4 greens and 1 red, but I could still get a number that is lower than red or blue. So let's log these. If I console.log my R, G, and B, you'll see every time I run this sketch, I'm doing this 5 times with my loop, even though uh, I don't have a draw function. We're still drawing 5 circles. But these numbers are really long. Let's actually cut these off just for the sake of um, this example. So I'm just going to round these numbers. So I'm going to use the round function, which is another function we get from math. And I'm going to put it around these numbers so that we can read them a little bit more easily. Okay, so let's look at these and compare them. So here's our first color. So there's 4 red, there's a lot of green, 188 green, and not too much blue. And so that gives us this pretty green, pretty light color. So that kind of makes sense. Our next one, we have a lot of green here, 240. Not much red, not much blue. That gives us this color. That makes sense. A lot of green, not much of the other ones. But look here, we have 7 red, 7 green, and we have 92 blue. So the result of that is something that's pretty blue. And it's pretty dark as well because our numbers are all quite low. And so even though we're mostly getting green, we're still getting this one blue uh, possibility. So if we want to make sure that we're always getting green, one thing I can do is I can say, well, the lowest green value is going to be higher than the highest red or blue value. So I could say 150 for green. So now I'm always getting green. No matter how many times I run this, even though I still have random different colors, they're always at least more green than my other 2 colors, red and blue. So that's another way that I can kind of control the randomness if I want a specific outcome. You don't have to do that, but if you want to say, if you were making like a nice field of grass, but you wanted all your blades of grass to have slightly different colors with, that show kind of like the different shadows and highlights from the sun and stuff like that, it would be very useful to be able to create lots of random colors, but make sure that they're always green. So that's one way we can do that. Of course, I can do that with the other colors if I want to. So I've got my nice green guys. I think that's good to kind of talk about color. So let's look at our circle now. So we looked at color. We can also change the size. Let's change the position first, and then we'll come back to size. Position is going to be a little bit easier. So the X position is determined by my loop. So my first let X equals 100, that sets the position of my first part of my pattern, this first circle. Then in my second condition, I say how far I want my loop to go. So as long as X is less than 500, so we can see 500 is over here. And so we keep going with our pattern until we hit that point. And then we increment each time by 100. So we move over by 100 each time. So let's leave X alone for a second. We haven't touched Y at all. Okay, so if I want to randomize the position of my pattern, I could say, let's make a new variable for Y. And so I'll say variable Y, and I can randomize it. So if I say random, of course I can use, I know that my canvas is 400 pixels tall. Okay, so I might want to use, I could use 400, but if I do that, we'll see that some of my self-portraits will go too high up or too far down. They're going to get clipped off. That might be okay depending on the design that you're going for, but we'll see, we can fix that. So now I'm going to replace this 200 with Y. So we're getting randomness with the background face, but we're not getting it with the face components yet because we haven't implemented it across all of our eyes and our mouth. But that's okay. We can at least see that we are getting that randomness. And we also see that we get cut off sometimes. So we're saying random. If we only have one number, then the default minimum range is 0. So this is 0 to 400. Okay, so here's 0 up here. And if we draw a circle from the middle, some random number right there, it could be close enough to here that it's going to get cut off. Same thing down here. This gets cut off a little bit because this is 400 right here. So if we want to make sure that we don't go below 0 or above 400, we know the size of our circle is 100. So we know that half of the circle is 50. So instead of going from 0 to 400, we could go from 50, somewhere around here, and then to 400 minus 50, somewhere down here. And we could also, change that depending on the size of the canvas. So we can put that in. So instead of 400, let's start with 50, and let's go to height, the height of the canvas, minus that same value, minus 50. And so now we're still getting a lot of randomness, but we don't overlap with the edge. And of course, since we're using the height variable here, if I change the size of the canvas, let's say I change this to be 600, we're still never going to be overlapping. So that's a good thing to use our variables for. Okay, so let's make the rest of our faces match. Although it does kind of look cool when the background of the face is not in the same place as the mouth and eyes. Maybe that's something that you like and want to keep in your pattern. But let's add it to the rest. So for my eyes and my mouth, I set the Y position using that 200 that I originally had, and then subtracting or adding 20. So let's just throw in Y there, and now we will get our shapes in the same place. And so now we have our pattern moving around. And you might say, I don't really like that it's kind of like just completely random. What if I wanted to have like a nice curve or something like that? This is another thing that we could do. Let's start moving by moving Y up to the beginning of our program. Okay, so now we have a random number, just like we did before with our colors. We have a random number, but it applies to each one of our self-portraits as we go through the loop, because Y is not inside the loop, so we're not resetting Y as we go through. But I can change Y. Y is just a variable. So let's say after each time, I'm going to change Y. I'm going to say Y plus equals, let's say 20. Now we're going to get a little line going down. If I said negative 20, we get a little line going up. But what if I say something random? I can also use randomness here. I could say random somewhere between negative 20 and 20. Okay, so now I get a nice little curve. And if I increase this number a little bit, 40 and 40, we get some different designs. So we can also randomize not just the number itself, but we can randomize some series of numbers by using a little bit of math. Okay, so I'll do one more example, and then I'll go over submitting the assignment. Um, so we can also do size. There's obviously a lot of size values here, but one thing that we could play with is actually the orientation of the face. So I've got all these numbers here. This is a little bit like when we just learned about variables in the first place. Anytime I have a number that's just a hard-coded number, I can put randomness in there and I'll get some interesting results. So I could literally just put random right here in the function itself. And so now each one of my faces has this slightly different expression because I added some randomness to this x variable. So this is just the space between the eyes. So the x is in the middle, one is going to the right, plus 20, one is going to the left, minus 20. But if I randomize that, I get these different variations. So sometimes the eyes are very close together, sometimes they're far apart. Of course, sometimes they're like overlapping, so you might want to make it so that doesn't happen. But you can get some kind of interesting effects there. But then notice I also have these 20s here, more 20s. I've got a lot of 20s. So what happens if we just randomize that number altogether? So let's make an S variable and say random with 20. And I'll put S in place of all of these guys. And let's see what happens. So now the eyes, the distance and the size are always relative to each other because I'm using the same numbers, but they're different in each self-portrait. So we get these kind of different effects. So again, we have these different variations. And then some of them are too small. So this is another case where actually maybe I want the smallest to be 20 and the largest to be like 100. That might be too big. I'm getting some crazy. Yeah, 100 is too big. Let's try just 40. So now I'm getting some like little frog looking guys. So that's kind of fun. Okay, there's a lot more we could do with this. You could put randomness in a ton of places, but we're uh, using up a lot of time. So I do want to go over for submitting this assignment. Again, since we have these different variations, let's use multiple images in the submission to show some of the variations. So since we're just using the setup function for this, let's just put at the very bottom, let's just save an image, and we can save random dash pattern.jpg. And so now if I run it, it's going to save, and I'll just do it 2 or 3 times so I have a few on my computer. Just to show a few different variations. And so then I can post that. I'll just go over this quickly. So I'll go to the Open Lab and I'll just make a new post. So I'm already logged in. Of course, you need to log in if you're not. I'm just going to click the plus button to add a new post. And I'll go to the category and find the assignment. So this one is assignment 8, pattern variations. And oh, how do we do size and color at the same time? So do you mean like using the same variable or just having variation of both size and color? Okay. Um, so in the example here, I do have some like I'm varying the color here using the fill, and then I'm varying the size here just using a random number here. So if you're talking about the overall size, I didn't vary that, but I could. I could. One of the reasons I didn't do that actually is because the shapes are right next to each other. But let's do it anyway. I could, so this 100 here determines the size of the face. So let's make a random number for that. So I could say face size equals, and let's say random, let's say we don't want to go below maybe 50, don't want to go too high, so let's say 200. And then I can just throw the face size in for that size variable for the circle. Oops. Oh, I'm going to turn off the save for a second. Okay, so now we're getting different face sizes. The eyes and the mouth are still the same because that variation is based on this number here. But I could base that on this face size. I could say, um, let's say S is face size plus random 20 to 40. So that way the eyes and although that's too big. Let's say face size divided by 2. That's still too big. Let's say divided by 4. There we go. Okay. That's a little more reasonable. Um, so once you vary the size of the whole thing, you may want to also set that relative to like the parts that are inside. But of course, if you're not making a face, if you're making a more abstract pattern or something else, this may not apply. But once you create that basic size, you can use it to affect other things. And then you can add randomness on top of that or not, if you want to. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a little bit trickier because if I put in just to show as before, if I put the draw function back in, it's going to look insane. Like they're just going to be going all over the place. Um, which might be kind of cool. You could get some kind of cool effects like that, but it's probably a little bit too uncontrolled. So we'll look at different ways to deal with that next week and like in future lessons. Um, the data structures that you need to be able to like control that many parameters is a little bit outside of the sort of like aspect of this class. But I could go over it maybe in a later lesson. Just if people are interested, I could. We basically just need like lists, and lists aren't that crazy, but they're just a little bit, it's a little bit harder to understand. But I could go over it in a later lesson. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'll do that next time. You mean like choosing like one shape versus another shape? Yeah. Yeah, that's in the next one. Yeah. Um, but it's quite similar to the conditional logic stuff that we've already done, so you might be able to figure it out on your own. Or I think if you look in the, let's see, if we go here, or no, I think actually it's a week after next week if we do this one. Yeah. I talk about it here, choosing shapes. So you can basically take like a random number and then draw one shape or another based on what the outcome is. So you could look at that here. Um, but yeah, those are all good questions. So where was I? Let's turn this off and finish documenting. So I was creating a new post. I selected the category, put in my pattern, and gonna add a gallery and upload those images that I just downloaded. And as long as you have like 3 or 4 images that just shows that there is some variation going on, that should be fine. And so you can say my pattern program varies the color, size, and position of my kind of like frog looking guys, frog self-portrait. And then of course, we always want to include a link to our code. So I'll just throw that in there. And I don't want to embed it, so I'm just going to click convert to link. And there we go. So can publish that. I forgot to preview it. Should preview it first, but you can always edit it later. So let's take a look at what that looks like. That looks good. So yeah, that's basically it for this assignment. So with the pattern and the variation, it doesn't have to be super complicated. You can see I'm only using 4 total shapes and 2 colors. So you know, depending on what you want to do with the pattern, just think about what can I simplify about this? What will look interesting if I add some variation to this, and just try adding random numbers in different places and seeing what the outcome is. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just kind of getting a sense of how the random function works. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the recording here. I'll share those examples, and then of course I'll upload the video.